This is a demonstration of common watercolor techniques. Before you start, you should tape your paper to a board. Here I used blue painter's tape, which is sufficient for practice. I also gathered several brushes, types of watercolor paint, a sponge, and various other materials needed for these techniques. I also suggest that you have several pieces of paper towel handy for both the techniques and accidents that may happen as you work. Additionally, make sure you clean the palette you are using before you start. This is harder when people use acrylic in these trays. Make sure you clean yours after use. For this demo, I divided my paper into several squares and labeled them in order to practice the techniques. I activated the paints by adding a drop or two of water to each color in the pan before I started working. When starting the graded wet wash, wet the paper first and then apply an activated watercolor to one part of the square. I normally start at the top and then add a little water to the bottom portion to help the paint lighten or fade out as it goes away from the area where I applied the paint. One word of caution I would give you is to put the graded wet and graded dry washes toward the bottom of the page so you can continue adding water to them to really dilute the color you use. I believe the square I used was too small, or perhaps my board was tipped slightly because the color continued to run. I even tried to blot the graded wash, but it didn't work very well. My graded dry wash is also too uniform in color, but I was attempting to show you washes without removing any of the color, which is really hard to do in such a small area. When I created the dry wash, I added the color to the page and then again used some water on the brush to attempt to gradate the color from light to dark. Graded wet and dry washes are two techniques that will be used often in watercolor paintings. You can see this demonstrated more thoroughly in the flowering crab tree painting. There are two splatter techniques demonstrated here. One technique uses a finger to tap paint from the brush onto the paper. The other uses a toothbrush to splatter paint onto the paper. Notice the toothbrush version is much finer or smaller splattering than the first. Both techniques can be used for things like the splash from waves or rock texture. I then demonstrated wet on wet, specifically dropping one color into another. Please note that I dropped colors close to each other on the color wheel for this. If you use complementary colors, you will end up with brown or gray in areas. This may work for your composition, but just be aware. I used two different sized small brushes for demonstrating dry brushing techniques. This technique can be used for things like individual hairs or other fine lines in a painting. I just scumbled with the brush to demonstrate it can also be used for things like foliage of trees. You can also use it to create linear quality in woven material. I next demonstrated using a sponge with watercolor. One thing to note here is that you do need to get the sponge wet. However, as I did this, I dripped water on a previous technique, the graded dry, which you will probably notice more later. As I used the sponge, I used multiple parts of the sponge and rotated my grip on the sponge so that the marks were not uniform like a computer. This technique is great for stimulating foliage in trees as long as you remember to turn your wrist or sponge in several directions as you apply the paint. In order to lift paint, you first have to apply some to the paper. Once the paint was on the paper, I used a crumpled paper towel to remove some of the paint. The crumpled paper towel leaves marks like clouds if you rotate your hand as you attempt to remove the paint. As you noticed earlier, this can be done on a large area to remove paint while it's still wet. As long as you do this quickly, you should be able to remove most of the paint if you get something in an area by mistake. Next, I demonstrated something called scoring. Here I used the rounded end of a flat wooden toothpick, but you could use anything that is hard and has a rounded end, like a bone folder or a double ball stylus. Anything that's not going to make a mark. To do this technique, you are supposed to scratch the surface of the paper and then put paint over it. The paint is supposed to pool in the recessed areas, creating a darker area where you made the mark. However, I didn't push hard enough and attempted it again, both in a dry area and a wet area, so it could be clearly seen. Another word of caution here is that scratching the paper too hard when it's wet may make the paper come apart, so be careful. I then demonstrated a resist technique with tape. Notice you can put a piece of tape on paper and cut it with an X-Acto knife. If you cut carefully enough, you will have a fine detail cutout that is added to your piece. However, be careful not to cut too deep or you may ruin your painting. Notice, you also have to be careful so the tape edges don't show. I didn't care about that for this demo, but did show adding other ripped tape pieces before I painted over them all. Notice I let this dry completely before taking the tape off the paper. The other resist technique is using a medium called Frisket, which is like rubber cement. I normally caution away from using brushes for this as the medium is difficult if not impossible to remove from the brush, thus ruining the brush. There are some clay modeling tools in the classroom that are reserved for this purpose. It will take some time getting familiar enough with how to apply the Frisket. It's also extremely important that you put the material on and wait for it to dry before painting over it. You also then have to wait for it to dry before removing it. The directions on the bottle say to use it and remove it from the paper in 1 day, so you also have to have a chunk of time set aside for this technique. Using a hairdryer can help speed this process. Remove the Frisket gently with a clean eraser when finished. Doing things wet or too quickly will rip the paper. I then used a fan brush to show you can use that brush for things like bird feathers or certain tree branches. I also demonstrated cleaning the brush and reshaping it right away. You should really do this with all brushes, acrylic and oil too, when you are done using them. Another thing to note about watercolor painting is that there are several types of watercolor. I am showing 2, and Dr. Martin dye, which is actually ink. I organized my tray like the examples on my paper so that you understand what each may look like with a dry graded wash versus a wet graded wash, and also versus each other. I first used the liquid watercolor. Notice, I only used 1 drop in a clean part of the watercolor pan. I also added 1 to 2 drops of water before I used it. As I went to use the Dr. Martin dye, I also demonstrated opening a dropper versus a regular container. Be very careful with the non-dropper bottles. They will obviously create a huge mess if you tip them over when they are open. There are additional droppers to use in the classroom if that is the type of bottle you need to use. Similar to the liquid watercolor, I used 1 drop of the Dr. Martin dye, but shook the bottle before opening it. I again added a drop or 2 of water before using this media. Notice how much more saturated this color was than the liquid watercolor and how much farther it goes when using it. One thing to note if you like this saturation is that once the color is dry, it does not blend the way the watercolors do when they are re-wet a second time. Therefore, additional practice is probably a good idea. I then used the pan or cake watercolor. As I did this, I hope you also noticed the color differences between each of the greens that I used. This will happen as you use different materials because different manufacturers use different combinations of colors or may have patents on certain colors, meaning each one will be slightly different. This is not a big deal. It just means being flexible as an artist because you may have to be willing to mix colors if you want a very specific color. The last technique I demonstrated is using sea salt. I ran out and was at home, so I used rock salt used for your driveway. Those salt pieces are normally much bigger and may have other chemicals in them, so I would caution you away from that. Sea salt is safe and available in the classroom. Once you create a layer of paint on an area, you sprinkle some salt on it. Notice the paint pulls toward the salt. Allow this to dry completely and remove it for an unusual texture. I often find this very helpful for things like rocks or sand. Practicing these basic watercolor techniques should help you understand how watercolor works. See you next time.